Welcome to Listening with China Blue. This is a podcast that focuses on how listening not only informs us about what is occurring in the world around us, but also helps us connect with others, build stronger businesses, strengthens our mental health, and become more creative and compassionate individuals. As more and more people practice attentive listening in a community, it becomes a community building practice that strengthens our mental health as we learn from our neighbors. I will be interviewing people from all walks of life to learn how listening has informed them in their field and helped them to make intelligent decisions. They will be artists, musicians, composers, dancers, business people, psychologists, neuroscientists, and Buddhists, to name a few. About me, I'm an internationally exhibiting sound-based artist. In my work, Discovering Unheard Sounds, I realized that the core component that drove my work was simply listening. That realization put me on the path of speaking about and helping people learn to become better listeners. I began with leading sound walks, which I continue to do in the upstate New York region to help people learn to listen from nature. And now, tune your ears to this podcast to learn about the power of listening. And do pay attention until the end for further information on how to start your own listening practice, share it with others, and to support listening with China Blue. Today we are speaking with Eric Lewis. Eric Lewis is a professor of philosophy at McGill University, specializing in the philosophy of improvised art and Black aesthetics. He is the author of 5 books and numerous other publications. He is also on the management team of the International Institute for Critical Studies in Improvisation and the Toolkit for Care. He is the director of the Laboratory of Urban Culture and co-founder and president of Arts in the Margins. Eric is also an active improviser on brass and reeds and is a member of Tone Reve, the Free Jazz Messengers, the Tuned Air Trio, and the Instant Synthesis Ensemble. He also runs the annual New Media Residency in Koumaria, Greece. Welcome, Eric. I'm excited
Great.
to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you, China Blue, for inviting me, particularly for a podcast on a topic that's more important perhaps now than ever, which is that of listening, given the global failure of listening that seems to be taking
Mm,
place on so many fronts.
indeed, it is. And indeed, it's totally topical if you take it from that vantage point, from the political vantage points, it's all encompassing, right?
Indeed.
But I thought I would start with the fact that, our paths have crossed often, but actually the first time when we met was when you organized the memorial exhibition for Pauline Oliveros, Still Listening at the Armory in New York. I was so honored to be included in this exhibition and actually you also had this following wonderful website you created with Ellen Waterman, also called Still Listening. So I wanted to start off with um, the fact that you have had a long relationship with Pauline Oliveros and also with her philosophy. So I wanted to ask you to tell us about that and when it began.
Sure. Let me just start based on what you said. Ellen Waterman, in fact, was a co-organizer of the exhibit and the website from the
Right.
beginning, and it was first done in Montreal before it did move. Yes, I have known because I, in some very deep way, think I still know and have a kind of relationship with Pauline Oliveros for, I
Mm-hmm.
don't know, something like 15 years or so, which is
Mm-hmm.
far less than many of the folks in her circle that I know you have spoken to. But I think, like many of them, her influence on me was and continues to be profound, and it was and continues to be an important relationship for me. I first met Pauline performatively, in fact, at an iteration of the annual Guelph Jazz Festival and Colloquium. Must have been about 12, 15 years ago now. The artistic director and founder of that festival, Ajay Heble, has always done a marvelous job of bringing together disparate musicians who didn't know each other, who may come from distinct musical traditions, and having them form micro communities through collective improvisations.
Mm-hmm.
And this one year, the art gallery of the University of Guelph, the whole kind of museum gallery, was used as a space where I don't know whether it was a dozen to 20 improvising musicians were asked to locate themselves in different bits of the gallery, move as they saw fit, and improvise with whomever they happened to stumble upon, in effect, for whatever length of time seemed appropriate, at the
Mm-hmm.
moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I was one of those musicians, as was Pauline, who was also featured that year at the festival. I believe that's the year she performed a duo with Roscoe Mitchell, if I recall correctly. And at one moment in this sort of extended improvisation, Pauline and I, who did not know each other, found ourselves performing a duo.
Mm-hmm.
My guess is it could not really have lasted as a duo for more than maybe 3 minutes,
Mm-hmm.
but those were um, extremely important 3 minutes for me to this day. I'm a rather unschooled musician improviser, at
Mm-hmm.
that time exclusively on brass. And I was playing, I think, pocket trumpet, and I was playing extremely dense, unpitched tone clusters, the kind of boom, And if you had asked me what pitches I was actually playing, I actually could not tell you, and many of them were in effect unpitched, were emphasizing the upper harmonic series, those kind of messy, noisy kinds of runs. And Pauline had her accordion, and she was sitting down, I remember, and her head was sort of cocked to the side, and we were engaging in a very standard improvisational duo method of call and response, right? A kind of
Mm-hmm.
ancient musical method. So I'd play this little fractured riff, and she would pause for the slightest moment and play something in response.
Mm-hmm.
And we did this, I don't know, must have been for a minute or so. And suddenly it was like a bomb dropped. I realized what she was doing. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and what she was doing in real time, which is just the most amazing part of it, was she was hearing every individual, non-note or pitch I was playing to her, and was using just though that pitch class, but repackaging it and playing it in response. And of course, her responses using that pitch class were, in my mind, to this day, far more aesthetically pleasing, more beautiful. They made more sense. They had more internal structure and coherence. And this struck me on a number of different levels. One, it was clearly an act of listening of the highest order, because this was being done almost instantaneously, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, it was also an act of musical virtuosity of the highest order. Now, those two things in and of themselves, of course, make the moment special and make the person, Pauline, doing them special. But what I think took this further, and as a philosopher, made it even more significant to me was this struck me as a deeply ethical act and an
Mm.
act of community formation. Um, it was ethical pedagogy of the highest order. And as a university professor, as a teacher, it was a real model of what ethical pedagogy could look like. And this is what I mean by that. It was as if she was accepting my rather inchoate set of pitches as a sort of gift, right? And she said, okay, Eric, I'm accepting the materials. We're going to use your materials. I accept them as a gift, but let me demonstrate to you another way of treating those pitches, right? I'm not going to reject them, right? Because think about it. Someone else might have said, oh, Eric, he's playing some weird nonsense. I'm going to direct him in a different musical direction. Maybe I'm
Mm.
going to play extremely tonally. Maybe I'm going to play in a key signature. Maybe I'm going to play an obvious but simple melody, which perhaps he could, you know, improvise upon. She said, no, 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 Eric. I'm accepting what you've given to this situation. But here's a way you might want to think about these sounds.
Mm.
Here's a way of listening to them and responding to them in a way which you might find more aesthetically pleasing, more interesting. And of course, I did. You know, I heard the materials I had chosen suddenly having both kind of an inner and outer life far greater than that which they had when I was, arranging them together. And then, it must have been another minute and a half, and we moved on to play with other people. But I was dumbstruck, sort of literally.
Mm.
And it started me not just thinking about my own music making and listening practices more attentively, but I literally just thought, who was this person? I need to discover more about her and her practice. I really need
Uh-huh.
to do what I can to engage further. And that started me down a road where I was privileged to be able to work with Pauline and actually perform with her on a number of occasions in more kind of standard ensemble settings, because she was also a part of, at that time, it was called ICASP, Improvisation, Community, and Social Practice, a large Canadian-based research project which I was part of. And she was an important member of the a sub-research group, which I believe was titled um, Gender, the Body, and Improvisation. And although at the time my own research was not centralized on that topic, when I saw the wonderful set of individuals who were part of that group, it was Pauline and Sherry Tucker and Ellen Waterman and others. I said, I, you know, I want to go to these people's parties, right? They were fantastic researchers. They were working on interesting subjects. They were marvelous creators, both, in the arts and in the intellectual arts too. And they also obviously liked each other. They had
Mm.
fun working together. And I could not
Right.
but see this as an example of, given that they were all very careful listeners and many of them trained deep listeners in Pauline Oliveros's practice, that their listening facilitated the community they formed with each other's and the enjoyment they took in each other's company and in working together. And this was something I was so alien to my own academic practice, which was, as the stereotype goes, it was cutthroat, it was competitive, it was often solitary, it was not
Mm-hmm.
attempt to form community. And so I started working as a member of that group and got to know them all better, including Pauline, and then had opportunities to work with her both on academic projects, although that's a a little too essentialist way of thinking about them. They were all projects which were about people, right? And bringing people together, even if they had a kind of academic or theoretical patina to them, and then had opportunities to perform with her, all of which I to this day cherish very deeply.
I can see. That's just an amazing story to hear from so many different vantage points. You know, certainly getting for our audience to get to know more about who Pauline was. But
Mhm.
what I'm even more intrigued by is how you describe the process of improvisation. And most people know what the word improvisation means, but from the viewpoint of the improviser, you summarized it in such an eloquent way to describe what the interaction is involved with and how you engage, and that it is a moment by moment decision making process that is mostly about play and how well you play together.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, as a philosopher of improvisation, and
Yes, yes.
there aren't all that many of us out there, although there are quite a few, and quite frankly, a deeply held view I have, not necessarily shared by many other so-called academic philosophers, is Pauline Oliveros is a philosopher of improvisation.
Surely.
Billie Holiday was a philosopher of improvisation. John Coltrane was a philosopher of improvisation, right?
Absolutely.
These were all people who thought critically and deeply about the practice and enacted it and modified their relationships to it in the light of discovering new things about it and presented to us, not always discursively or exclusively discursively, a philosophy of what it is and crucially what it could be. Right?
Mhm.
Philosophy to me is deeply about possibility and not just actuality. It's about what a situation can become or what kinds of meanings could come to represent. One thing we've learned from feminist and critical race theorists about improvisation is it's not necessarily a positive, egalitarian, anti-hierarchical practice. There are forms of improvisation which basically take the form of he, and it would be usually be a he, who speaks loudest, gets heard, and takes control over an improvisation. Certainly, this is anathema to Pauline's whole practice and something she both recognize that potentiality, but also recognize the community forming, the caring that can be enacted and embodied and in an improvising space. And she demonstrated and theorized to us positively about how that might go. So, you know, what it is to improvise is a big question. And I think there's certain things we need to realize about the practice before we can really even ask that question in a way that might reveal something to us of interest. Um, we're improvising right now. Of
Sure.
course, there are certain guidelines that our conversation is intended to follow, right? You told me what we were going to talk about. It
Mhm.
would be odd if in the next 5 seconds I simply started reciting names from the phone book, or reading passages from the Quran,
Or
or
recipes.
make or recipes or animal noises, right? But we are improvising. Improvising is a ubiquitous human practice. Right? And I think that the hegemony of Western musical theory has made us think playing composed music is the standard practice. And we need to think of improvisation as somehow a deviation from this, as an odd thing which is peculiar. It's as if, well,
Mm.
it's natural to have a score in front of you and play it with other folks. And of course, we can even talk about community formation and care and that musical practice. They're by no means absent, right? But I like to kind of flip the script, and I often say even to my students, what would our theorizing look like if we just took improvisation as this natural thing that we all understand and we do it all along, and then looked at this other practice. Look at this weird thing. They've got these pieces of paper in front of them with dots and lines, and they seem to be reading it, and then they're making sounds based on like what the hell's going on here, right? Right. If we took that approach, I think we would be more open to seeing those features of the improvisatory as part and parcel of what it is to realize what it is to be a human being in the world, right? It's a natural and necessary thing. It is how we engage with others, it's how we engage with our environment, and it's how we engage with ourselves, right? When you're thinking to yourself, right? Whether walking idly down the street or in the dream world, another world very important to Pauline and her life partner Ione. This is a highly improvisatory kind of act you're having with yourself. So part of the attempt to define the improvisatory almost reduces to recognizing you need to, in a certain sense, give up attempting to define the improvisatory because it's a much broader and more natural kind of practice which we
Well, that
engage in
that
all the time and in so many ways.
that also takes us back to the point of listening,
Mhm. Yeah.
which is a core component. And I was thinking about just your process of listening
Mhm.
and your dedication to improvisation and how
Mhm.
that's woven together.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, my own musical practice is a somewhat non-standard one. I take great pleasure in listening to a wide range of musics produced over the millennia from assorted cultures and places and times.
Mhm.
Um, but I've never wanted to play the music of other people, even music I really love. I have always been, in that sense, an improviser. Going back like to high school, going back to, playing in no wave bands and just when someone puts a score in front of me, the way I read it is not so much as a set of precise instructions directed at what sounds to produce and when, which is a kind of rough account of what standard notation is asking of you, right? But
Sure.
I kind of read it maybe as a philosopher. I look at the score and I ask myself, what is this piece of music meant to do or feel like? Or how is it going? What is the expressiveness that I think is being embodied or encoded in these little squiggles and dots, right?
Mhm.
And then I ask myself, how do I relate to those? How do I relate to those at the very moment? Or, oh, it's a happy lilting melody. Well, do I feel happy and lilting at the moment, or do I want to respond to that in a certain way? And then in my own mind, I'm playing the score, but I'm reading the score in a different way. And that's always been my relationship to kind of scored music. Sometimes people think, oh, you're a free improviser, you must hate, you know, Lester Young, you must hate Bach. I'm like, no, I go home and I listen to Lester Young or Lester Bowie, I listen to, musical traditions that are deeply rooted in sophisticated forms of standard notation. But it's never been how I want to produce music because I've always thought that music making, among other things, is an exploration of simultaneously what's magical about it. It's simultaneously an exploration of your own self at that moment, of the space you're in, of the community of fellow musicians who you are performing with, and whoever else might be in the environment. Um, I can't tell you how many times I've improvised with people I know quite well, people who I might play with regularly, and we've played, I don't know, for 20 minutes, and then we stop, and I'll turn to the bass player and I'll say, what's wrong today? You're obviously not feeling well. You're worried about something. Because I heard that in their improvisation. I learned things about their subjectivities, right, through our interaction. Profound things often, things that I might not have been able to glean otherwise. And by responding to that, their subjectivity in certain ways, I'm learning about my own being and subjectivity, right? So for me, and I'm not universalizing this claim, but for me, I find that less apparent when there are rather strict guidelines placed on the
Sure.
musical responses we're intended to make while playing traditionally scored music. So that's in one sense why I'm an improviser, right?
Yeah, I think it seems to capture the whole essence of your presence. You're not just a tool with fingers and a mouth to articulate what's written on the page, because that sort of takes out the personality of the person that's presenting, and all the notes on the page indicate, a level of forcefulness or a level of softness or whatever the composer had in mind. But as soon as you inject your own emotional response as well as physical response to the music that you're playing, as well as to your co-musicians, that it envelops not only your own presence, your own humanity, but everybody else's.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, again, I don't want, what I'm saying is not to deny these things can happen in a classical string quartet.
Oh, sure.
People who play in those contexts report very much the same thing.
Mm,
Um, that's why I think composition and improvisation are not diametrically opposed. They form the ends of a continuum, and practices often, locate themselves even in the same piece at different places in this continuum. Um, which is why many philosophical analyses of improvisation, I think, are very sterile and are doomed to fail because they treat it as an either or ontology, right? You're improvising or you're playing composed music, and then they end up tying themselves in knots, asking questions like, "But wait a second, John Coltrane, he's playing my favorite things, but now he's not playing my favorite things, but what's going on here? And what moment in this do we say now he's no longer playing it and now he's playing it again?" And they're sort of silly questions, right? When you ask the question, they sort of presents to me the answer, which is this must be the wrong way to think about it. If you're ending up having to decide something like, for the first 2 minutes and 48 seconds, he was playing my favorite things. Then for 17 minutes and 9 seconds, he does this separate thing, and then he returns to playing it again, right? The whole thing is about his relationship to, among other things, the song, its history, its embeddedness in social and cultural structures, his own personal performative history of it, and what's happening in that moment with himself and his fellow musicians, right? Um, so this is where I think a lot of philosophy of music gets things wrong out of the box and ends up saying often odd things about improvisation. Now, let me just be very clear about one thing. I'm talking about when card carrying philosophers decide to theorize about
Of
it. The
course, of
people who
course.
get it right are the Alice Coltrane's and the Pauline
Oh yes, of
Oliveroses and
course,
the
of
Jean
course.
Lees and the Anthony Braxtons, right, and the George Lewises, right? They know how silly this other kind of discourse often is. Um, I mean, I like to think Pauline, in many ways, and this will just reveal my own maybe intellectual underpinnings, um, both developing and responding to very ancient philosophical views about listening. Um, People like Heraclitus, who was a pre Socratic Greek philosopher, one of our earliest philosophers. I mean, he said things like, eyes and ears are poor witnesses for people if their souls do not understand the language.
Mm.
And what he seemed to realize was our senses, including hearing, are not like these passive tools that just present us with things and then we act upon them. It's sometimes called like a raw sense datum theory in the language of philosophy. But we need to come to know how to use them. We can train ourselves in using them. We need to understand their language, right? And the potentials of it. And I think Pauline's practice, in many ways, could be seen as a rich development with respect to the modality of listening, to the language of listening, to the language of the sonosphere. And in that sense, she's very much in keeping with some of our earliest, at least Western philosophical thoughts about listening. And indeed, and I'm just riffing here, I realize. Um, there are other things Heraclitus said, which I think fit in with some of these things Pauline says. Um, Heraclitus also has a fragment which says the hidden attunement is better than the obvious one. And
Hmm.
I think a number of Pauline's deep listening practices, and one of the goals is search for the hidden attunement, right? It's going to
So,
reveal
so does
itself to
that
you.
does that impact your work and your teachings?
Ah, yes. I mean, I think it certainly impacts my performative work as a musician, right? Listening and attempting to listen more deeply is implicated, I hope, in my group improvisations, but also in my own research. I think thinking about Pauline and her practice and her philosophy has me often return to certain subjects or texts or authors who I thought I may have understood, and I come to realize I was operating at a surface level of meaning and significance. I was not finding the hidden attunement, right? What might be an example? Well, there's a wonderful singer, Jean Lee. She passed in 2000, and she's someone whose creativity I both deeply respect and have been working academically on her oeuvre and how I think she was employed experimental vocal techniques to reclaim and construct her sense of self and identity against one often imposed by traditional song forms and jazz forms and the expectations of what it is to be a woman and a black woman jazz singer, right? And I was long puzzled by a performance on a duo album with Rand Blake of The Girl from Ipanema,
Hmm.
that classic tune. Um,
Sure.
and on this album, recorded live in Stockholm in the late 60s, mid to late 60s, she sings it silently, like it's there on the album. And every other song, she sings, in some fairly straightforward way. And then you go through the tracks, and there's the girl from Ipanema, and Rand Blake plays it in his sort of expansive, interpretive way, and there's no words.
Hmm.
And for a long time, I just didn't know what to make of this, right?
Were there any vocalizations?
None, nothing.
Huh.
It's not just that she doesn't sing the lyric. She does not,
She doesn't even hum.
she does not even hum. She is silent. And this silence deeply puzzled me. Now, of course, in some sense it still does, but it was thinking about Pauline's important use in theorizing about silence, about how silence can speak, about how being silent as an improviser is an action, is a choice, and is a contribution to the complete sound structure, made me ask myself, what is Jean Lee saying by saying nothing? That strikes me as a very Pauline Oliveros kind of question. Not just a question, but recognizing that she is saying something by saying nothing at all. Now, of course, the answer I give may not be correct, if there's such thing as a correct answer, but it did make me come to have an appreciation. I'll just tell you very quickly, my own response there is I think Jean Lee was very aware of the misogyny in the original lyric. When you think about it, it's about a young man on a beach who is upset that a beautiful young woman refuses to engage with him when he stares at her, right? He's a voyeur and he's pissed off. Why isn't she engaging with me, right? So the
Oh,
narrative in the song is a little creepy, right? Um,
yeah, yeah.
Various women jazz artists, I think, realized this. Ella Fitzgerald, in particular, and Sarah Vaughan changed it to the boy from Ipanema. They inverted the gender politics. And in their versions, a woman is there on the beach staring at an attractive young man walking by who refuses to engage with their perhaps voyeuristic ways of seeing. I think what Jean Lee did is she said, you know what? Inverting the gender dynamic is not particularly making it better. This form of voyeurism is creepy, full stop. I'm going to have nothing to do with this. What I'm saying is this kind of encounter between, and it is a kind of heteronormative backdrop, right? She's saying is just wrong, right? And I think her silence, right, her playing, her singing the song by not singing the song, is a way of her critiquing the gender dynamics and politics in either version of the song. Now, this might be a completely wacky interpretation. My point is not so much that thinking deeply about silence and listening in a way I've learned from Pauline Oliveros gets the right answer, but it got me to think in these terms, to recognize that Jean Lee's silence is an act, right, is intentional, is a product of her own agency, and therefore is meaningful. Right? And I think one thing we know from Pauline's practice is just how meaningful silences can be.
Can you illustrate that in her practice? Is that presented musically or is that presented philosophically?
I think both. So I think a good example of her musical practice is she had a trio called the Space Between Trio. The space between what? The space between the notes, right? The space between the sounds. This is a trio which, in its very name, um, was saying what's equally important is when we're not playing. And not just when we're not playing, but to put it in this kind of Jean Lee-like sense, what we're not playing, right? What is the meaning of our choices to remain silent at various times? So that strikes me as a trio that announces itself as foregrounding the importance of silences. There's a longer tradition of this, of course, in Western art music and other musics, right? 433 by John Cage is an obvious example, but it seems to be discharging a different kind of purpose. There's a piece called Silence by Wadada Leo Smith that was recorded in Paris in 1969 under an Anthony Braxton-led ensemble, and he has interpreted that politically over the years. So I think that's an example performatively, but many of Pauline's listening exercises involve things that either will operate at the threshold of our hearing, or you might think beyond our hearing, right? To listen like you have ears on the bottom of your feet, right? You know, to listen to the silences, to hear the space that you're within. These are all ways of, among other things, drawing attention to the fact that our sonosphere is not this is not full of this kind of positively valenced thing called sounds, and the rest doesn't matter, but it's always a combination of sounds and silences, and they themselves are in discourse with each other, are in a sense improvising with each other, right? And if you fail to focus on the silences, whether in the time domain, right, the time between hearing sounds, or spatially, when you're listening to your environment and where there aren't sounds coming from and where the sounds are different and how this might change and move, if you don't do that, you're engaged in impoverished listening. So I think there's both a kind of theoretical and a practical side to it. And that's one reason why Pauline is one of the great practical philosophers, right? She writes theory and she lives it and performs it, right? And there's a real consistency, I think, between the two. A lot of great thinkers, I think, have been great listeners and have foregrounded the importance of listening in coming to understand not just our sonosphere, but our reality writ large. You know, W.B. Du Bois in The Souls of Black Folks, in some of the most crucial chapters in that unbelievably important and influential work, basically says, let's now just listen to the accounts of some sharecroppers in Georgia. Right? Let's just listen to them. That is a way we're going to learn things which the theory in and of itself might not be able to transmit to us, right? Um, so yeah, I mean, for me, Pauline is a great philosopher, you know.
It sounds like her life and her contributions have been totally embraced by you and folded into your life and your work in a way that makes it your own version of it.
Well, again, I wouldn't want to overemphasize my engagement. It's very important to me, but I am not in any ways uniquely in that position, nor am I someone who somehow has, privilege to her hidden meaning, which others do not.
Oh,
Right?
no, no, no.
There are so many folks
I
who,
wasn't implying that at
yeah, no.
all.
I just
No.
want to make sure no one thinks that's what I'm saying
Oh, Lordy.
of my own engagement.
No, I was
I mean,
just trying to, I was thinking about, because we've spoken so much about Pauline, and I was thinking, well, I want you to talk about you more than
sure,
Pauline, because,
yeah,
clearly we started off with her as the
mm,
beginning topic, but,
mm,
I'm interested in about people's activities today in terms
mm,
of not following another person's
mm,
practice nor embracing another person's
mm,
practice, but what are you as um, how does listening, how is that imbued in your work
mm.
today?
Yeah. Well, look, things I learned from Pauline that I think try to embody or implement in my own practices are numerous. Two that
Sure.
are very important to me in my own practice is seeing collective improvisation as a site of social interaction, not just musical, as a site where care could perhaps be implemented or denied. And certain parts of my practice are due to this. For example, I'm part of a large European based research project called the Toolkit of Care. And
Yeah, I was wondering what that was.
this is a project bringing together um, artists, primarily artists who work digitally, but not exclusively, whether with sound or image or video or light or what have you. And we ask ourselves, how can our practice writ large embody and implement care? Care for each other at times where it's difficult to be an artist, care for the communities we work with and for, because many of us work on very site specific work, whether
Mm-hmm.
it's sound walks in Greek villages or making a multimedia installation, in a wine vineyard in Portugal or what have you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and seeing the caring potential of these practices is something I think I learned from Pauline and is now an important part of my own practice, both theorizing about that and attempting to implement it. And of course, also the work I do again in community with others, many of them in the Pauline Oliveros circle, on the adaptive use musical instrument, which was and continues to be a digital platform to allow individuals with very limited motor control to make music. But what it took me a while to learn is it's really a tool to allow them to form community across barriers of difference, here perhaps physical difference or ability difference. And that Pauline was always very clear about that's what it was for and about. So that's another a bit of my practice that was deeply informed by hers, both continuing to work on this project itself and to listen for difference. That to understand difference, we need to listen. And this has become, I think, now a more accepted way of thinking about difference, whether it's difference at, at the level not just of kind of musical ability, but differences along scales of identity, right, across race, across genders, across cultural difference, that reconciliation, and I use that term here, I think, carefully with respect to issues involving indigenous people and colonizers here in Canada and on Turtle Island more generally, has to involve acts of deep listening. We need to listen across barriers of distance, and failures to treat each other ethically often are due to failures to listen. Um, and so that's something I try to inform myself in my both in my theory and in my teaching. Um, and it could be something as simple as this. I used to think, we all teach, and they're the students who say nothing at all, right? Maybe for a whole term. And it's very easy to discount them, right? So you take your class and you parse it into two groups. The ones who are actively engaged, those are the ones that talk, right? And then the ones that aren't because
Mm-hmm.
they don't talk.
Right. Right.
Then it made me think that may be a deeply unfair and inaccurate way of thinking about these groups, right?
Absolutely.
People who are silent are actively choosing to be silent. And
Mm-hmm.
I should be asking myself why. And maybe there are things I'm not doing that I should be doing. And certainly over the years, and I hope this is something I continue to do, is I pay attention to the silences. And often I discover interesting things, maybe disturbing things, maybe helpful things, maybe things that require I have to change something about my classroom space, or not. But that also is a
Well,
kind of result of thinking about listening deeply.
well, I wanted to interject that
Mm-hmm.
I'm one of those people that would never speak for the length of the course. The reason is because I'm actually always, it seems like from the very beginning, attuned to listening and absorbing and taking in. And and I come from an era where, when you're in a school, the teacher or the professor is older. So it was always showing respect for this older person who comes with a body of knowledge. And then in the process of absorbing it, you find a way of taking away what you want or need from it. And so in that scenario, if you are the recipient of information, being totally actively involved in asking a myriad of questions, I find, like in this process of talking to you, is interrupting their train of thought. I find it sometimes very aggressive and invasive action to be engaged in.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of reasons why a student may choose to be silent. The same way that, or a lot of reasons why you might choose to be silent at any moment in a collective improvisation. And it might reflect on any number of features. One thing I'm hearing that you were saying was one reason you were silent is because you were deeply listening, right, to
Mm-hmm.
what was being said. Um, Look, I mean, this is often gendered.
Oh, sure.
There are often, young men in my classes who feel a almost moral obligation to have their hand go up almost before the lecture's even started, right? Just
before the
there it
que-
is,
before the question
um,
is asked.
and they interrupt others.
Oh,
This is
yes.
actually related to something which also I think it was thinking about Pauline Oliveros that started me on this. During COVID, many of us had to go to sort of Zoom-based pedagogy. And there
Sure.
was a lot of work that was done and continues to be done to try to improve audio and video
Mm-hmm.
in these streams. And all my colleagues were like, I need a better microphone, I need better speakers, I need to get.
Hmm.
And
Sure.
I took the exact opposite. I love bad audio in remotely distributed pedagogy, and here's why. Um, I don't think you, and this is something I think, again, I'm just thinking of this now. Pauline was so aware of this, that a virtual world opens up possibilities that our physical world doesn't, for all individuals to some degree, and for certain individuals for a much greater degree. Which is why she would have concerts and meetings in Second Life, one of the early
Hmm.
virtual digital environments. Why did I think this? Well, when you have a bad audio signal on Zoom, and as it often would be the case, a woman would be speaking in the class, and some boy would speak over her. The whole audio signal goes bad, right? All you get is noise. And everyone would tell him to shut up, right? That wouldn't happen in the live space, right? I wanted an audio signal that really only allows one person at a time to speak, because that created a more sonically egalitarian space.
Yay.
When we reproduce audio and video like the real space to the greatest degree as possible, we also reproduce the political power dynamics of those spaces. And I think what
Sure.
Pauline realized is virtual spaces can be designed and used in ways to undermine and correct imbalances in power, imbalances in equity, imbalances in care that might manifest themselves for certain communities in the real world, right? And so, to this day, right, I'm like, don't give me a perfect audio signal. No, no, no. Play with the noise. The noise is your
Right.
friend. It can be. Um,
Eric, I'm sorry to say, but we only have a few minutes left in our time together.
hmm.
So I
It
wanted
flew
to,
by.
it did. I wanted to find out from you if you have anything on your calendar that you are planning to be involved in the near future. Any programs, any
Yeah.
performances?
Well, I and a close musical and kind of work collaborator, Peter Burton, established a non-for-profit about 5 years ago called Arts in the Margins. And we do a lot of community-facing work. Basically, we see the arts writ large, and music we tend to focus on, but not exclusively, as a community building tool. And we've added last year, for the first time, it's becoming annual, a festival called the Flux Festival. It'll take place in the first week of October here in Montreal. So we're busy curating that, and it's a highly community facing festival. It's a festival where we try to bring diversity to the stage of many sorts, but also work very hard on a much more difficult form of diversity, which is diversifying audiences. We're
Mm-hmm.
very interested in thinking about how to do that, creating spaces that are safe and welcoming, not just to the usual audience for creative improvised music, which still tends to be highly male, highly white, highly cisgendered, highly educated, right? We don't think like that. We do not believe there's real diversity and equity if it's only on the performance stage, but not also reflected in audiences in the communities that feel like the music is theirs. So that's
Mm-hmm.
a big thing we're working on, and we're
That
estab-
that sounds wonderful, Eric. I'm looking forward to hearing more about that. Unfortunately, we are at the end of our program.
Sure.
So thank you so very much. And I'm looking forward to our future conversations on all things listening.
Great. Well, thanks again. It was wonderful to both listen to you and listen with you for the past hour or so.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Listening with China Blue. I hope it inspires you to build your own listening practice. This begins as a daily practice of attentively listening without judgment. And ask yourself, what is your version of silence? If you want to learn more about me and my work, go to chinablueart.com and please follow me on Facebook and at Instagram. Thank you.